Thank you guys all for coming out on this interesting night. Thank you for coming. I need to warn you that my journey to Chadron was not straight. Chadron, that's how I said it when I was interviewing. Was not a direct trip. It was marked by a number of detours and abrupt changes in direction. So fasten your seatbelts. Not that this is particularly exciting, but it does change directions frequently. This is where I was born. This little town of Atwater, and this isn't the large map of California, but if you can reckon that San Jose is down here at the bottom of the San Francisco Bay, that's Atwater. It is this far away from Yosemite, and I spent most of my childhood there. And the reason it's important that you know something about Atwater is because it helped me make a decision when I saw what Chadron looked like, because the towns are very similar. Back then, in Oakland, I went to California College of Arts and Crafts pretty much right out of high school. And that's a sweet little school, but I didn't stay there long. Happens frequently. I went soon after to Panama because my parents relocated, and I had spent some time in Washington, D.C. I came back to California. I was mooching off my parents for a little bit, and then they went to Panama. I went to Oakland, and then I joined them in Panama. This is the Panama Canal Junior College. I actually went to that one. That bridge is a bridge that crosses the isthmus from Panama to the other side of the canal, which runs north and south. Everybody thinks it goes east and west, but no. And so what was interesting about my time there is there were a lot of military bases, American military bases. We still ran the canal at that time. We don't now. But they would go across this bridge right over our classrooms with the tanks. So cool, so noisy. Like actually my early childhood in Atwater, that was a SAC base. Anybody know what a SAC base is? SAC, it's the Strategic Air Command, the big bombers, the ones that used to feature in the old movies about bombing Russia. The huge planes, so I had a childhood of them taking off over the school. But maybe that's the way it is in everybody's childhood, right? Maybe not. So, somewhat later, I met my husband-to-be in Panama. We were both students at the college. And we moved together to Washington, D.C., and soon, a few years after that, by that time we had 2 children, we moved to London. He worked for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Think of it. That odd that we would have ended up living a very different lifestyle in London. This is just one of those interruptions. While I was there, I took classes with the University of Maryland. They served most of the military bases in the area and the American military bases. And I took some very interesting English classes. My professor was a big Shakespeare freak, and we did classes. 2 semesters I did classes on Shakespeare because he was teaching them, and it was based on the plays that were appearing in London at the time. And you can imagine there's always plays. Shakespeare plays, but I actually went to this play with Judi Dench. I don't know if you can remember, she plays Mother, is it? M in the James Bond movies. But this was in her youth, and I saw her at Stratford-on-Avon. Big moment. This is the square where I lived. It was called Cleveland Square. It's in West 2, if you know anything about London. It's divided into north, south, east, west sectors. And southwest would have been, as you can imagine, in the southwest. And this one was like 2 blocks away from, help me, the park. Oh, Hyde Park. Yeah, it was a long 2 blocks, and another long 2 blocks to Paddington Station. So that's where you found Paddington Bear, right? And it was an interesting lifestyle. I was expected to belong to the women's club. There's an American women's club there. My husband belonged to the American men's club. What a surprise. We went to balls. I went to one ball. It was the British American ball. And at the time, the ambassador was Annenberg, who was a wealthy Texan. And his wife wore a gown that was cream satin, or not satin probably, but some version of silk. And she had purple feather little cap sleeves. And the jewelry you could see from across the ballroom were these rubies here and here. And I thought, that's impressive. But I also met the Duchess of Kent, one of the Queen's cousins, I think. So it was a very different lifestyle. And then marriage fell apart. I married somebody else. And he was a sandal maker in Dingle, Ireland. During the time that I was in London, I took classes at a technical college, and I learned weaving. I used to ride in Hyde Park a couple times a week, because this was my posh period. But I came in, I used to work at the stable also once the marriage fell apart and I was working. I was a daily. A daily is a woman who doesn't live in your house but comes to your house to clean it. So I had several houses that I cleaned depending on the day of the week. But the other job was in the stable, and the kid who was working in the stable, I had taken a day off at school, and I came in the next day and I told him, I spent all day yesterday spinning. And he says, weren't you dizzy? I know, I thought, I didn't explain that very well. But I will demonstrate by and by. This loom that you see here is something like the loom I had strapped to the roof of my car. Because I thought when I went to Ireland, I would teach, or I would set up shop, or something along those lines. So I had, by that time, a couple of spinning wheels. I still do. And the looms of various sizes, that being the biggest one, because who knew what would come. And when we were there, because my husband was an American and he had a shop in town, everybody came into his shop, because when you go to town, you hit all the shops. And an interesting sidebar to that is that in this town of Dingle, I'm not sure how many pub licenses there are, but way in the neighborhood, twice what would normally be needed, maybe 3 times as many licenses. You could buy beer in the hardware store, in the butcher shop, in a couple of other miscellaneous, not the laundromat as far as I know. But my husband was fond of that beverage, and we spend a fair amount in them. And I began to meet other people who found him interesting, and he was interesting. And they said, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a weaver. I had my loom set up in the house where we rented, and I had my wheels, and they said they wanted to learn. And they collaborated with their friends and begged. Now, I lived here in this town. This is the beginning of something called the Geltak. From here west is all Geltak. That means Irish speaking. And so Irish is still a first language in that part of Ireland. You may know that it happens in the northern part too, up in Galway and Sligo, that they still speak Irish as a first language. Many of my friends spoke Irish at home to their children, to their pets. And they're the ones who asked me to teach them. And one of the things that's interesting about my journey is that I was just kind of drifting along. I didn't have any big ambitions. But the night that I had my first lesson in my house, I had whatever I had. I made frame looms, which are just picture frames. You've done them probably in elementary school. I had drop spindles. I need to show you a drop spindle. And I might as well, because I suspect you might be interested, show you how you use a drop spindle. Anyhow, that night, after they left and I went to bed, my body was humming. I'd never had that sensation before. I lay there and I thought, what just happened? I call it, for the sake of simplicity, an epiphany, because I had never thought much about what I wanted to do. I was just doing whatever came along, mostly. And I knew that night, when I couldn't fall asleep, that I liked teaching. That teaching did something for me that I hadn't anticipated. It was a bit of a surprise. Okay, shall I give you a quick spinning lesson? This is wool. It's been combed or carded, either way. It's just ordinary, nothing fancy. The fibers are not, they're easily pulled apart. So the difference between that and this, which is a yarn, is this has got a lot of strength in it. That strength comes from twisting. So if I lay it across, if I lay the already spun yarn across the loose stuff, and I give this thing a spin, it'll start catching this wool. Oh, can't let go until it catches. By and by, you can start to see it's wrapping around, the white is wrapping around the brown thread. It's catching it. Because now there's twist. There's twist. These fingers are holding the twist back. When I open them, it'll run up and twist. The thing I just stretched attenuated it a little bit, and the spin goes up. This is the most primitive form of creating yarn. It's common in almost every culture. And it's a good way to get somebody introduced to spinning, because the spinning wheel is like rubbing your head and patting your tummy. You've got to do a couple things. You've got to do your feet, you got to do your hands, and this is a nice way to teach beginners how to manage that difference between the unspun and what becomes stronger. The more twist you put in, the stronger it gets. So I can go on because I've already taught the vocabulary lesson. Anyhow, I was in Ireland for about, I think 4 years. In the meantime, I had a child there. This, I think, may be a shot from the field where I used to, the house would have been where we're standing for this photo, and that would have been the view out the kitchen window. These old buildings down here might have been the old house we finally bought. We still own it as far as I know, but I haven't been back. I think I'll be going back for Christmas next year with one batch of my children who are planning this. Let me just see if I know. The house that we rented at the time was the new house, which is like located where we are. And that house had indoor plumbing insofar as you count a toilet and running cold water in the sinks. There was no shower. There was no hot water. It was interesting. And you heated the house with either coal or turf. Turf, we see peat all the time in garden bags of, looks like dirt, but peat, and it is dirt fundamentally, but it burns because it is really composed of old vegetation that has been in the ground for a long time. They dig it up, they dry it. It smells wonderful when you burn it. Not particularly hot. Coal is much hotter. And that's how we live. So we went from the ballroom to the to living rough. And when people say, "Were you a hippie?" I have to say I fit the description. At that time in my life especially. So anyway, this went on until I was fed up with being cold, and washing a baby in front of a fireplace loses its charm, and the baby certainly didn't enjoy it either. So when we came back, we settled in Boston. He's Boston Irish, which has got a long reputation of being characters and interesting and perhaps too fond of alcohol. We both got jobs. Now, while we were living there, and we often went home in the wintertime because our jobs depended on the tourists, and they went away in the winter. So I had during that time learned how to do word processing because my previous experience had not been exposed to that. It does date me. But thank goodness I learned this skill, because when we returned for permanent, I was able to get good jobs. That's why, in fact, I could stop teaching and go for the PhDs, because I had I was able to collect fairly good Social Security by that time. But while we were there, I was taking classes first at Northeastern. That's where my bachelor's is from. I got a bachelor's in business primarily because I was working for a company that would only pay for business classes. But I thought, if I get a bachelor's, then I can go for my master's, which is I did almost immediately. I was 50 when I got my bachelor's. And Northeastern is right downtown Boston. I'm not sure what its reputation is. It's really a college that provides cheap labor for many businesses in Boston because the kids, there's sort of a earn as you work, or whatever you call that. It's a program, that's what Northeastern was known for. And I initially was taking classes in suburbia because they had lots and lots of branches. But by the time I knew I needed to do something about becoming a teacher. And that's why I went at the bachelor's like that and then straight into the master's, because I was hoping to get a teaching degree. Now, Cambridge College is not the same thing as Cambridge, like in England. It's a school that I have called it, and it's been unkind, I call it a diploma mill because it provided classes on the weekends and at night, and it was mostly served people who already had a career and needed their master's in order to progress professionally. But it got me to that point where I could teach. I thank them for it. Things happened in my life, and I needed to bunk with my mom for a while. And I had to shift living situations from Boston to where my mother lived in Texas. She didn't live in Bandera, but I taught in Bandera, which is why the town where I lived was Kerrville, and where she lived, let's see, out of San Antonio on 10 North, that's an hour to get into San Antonio. And as it calls itself, the cowboy capital of the world, which is pure hyperbole. I've seen just as many cows here and cowboys. And nobody says a thing about Chadron being the cowboy capital, but these people they embrace their longhorns, and they have a fair number of dude ranches, so they need to hype the place. The town is not particularly remarkable, but I am very fond of it since they gave me an opportunity to work there on the condition I hadn't done my student teaching. I had a bachelor's in elementary education, and they needed a middle school special ed teacher. So all I had to do was commit to taking a certain number of classes, which was almost another master's. So I went for the other master's and took my classes in San Antonio, which is why I pointed out the commute. But I taught middle school. It was an experience that I remember fondly. It'll be a chapter in my autobiography because I had my eyes opened. Before that, I thought teaching was, I don't know, some sort of fantasy job that was going to be easy, and it turns out I didn't know very much about teaching. What a surprise, right? But the kids were patient, they didn't mind, and we had some very good experiences together, and I learned a lot. And those kids were my best teachers. But the important thing, here, maybe I can do this. Trying to read my notes and they're cut off. And then if I do that, we jump ahead. Let's see. Okay, I've already explained where it is. It has a generous river in town, lots of white-tailed deer, plenty of scrub oak, and numerous dude ranches, which I've already said. But the thing about teaching middle school kids, well, one of the nice things about middle school kids is they are still pretty young on some levels and way grown up on other levels. My classroom, I had a very mixed group of kids from 6th graders up to 8th graders, 16-year-old 8th graders, very different. None of them difficult, but many of them had learning issues that hadn't been covered. And there I was being inadequate when they needed somebody who could be adequate. And one of those students was Chris. And Chris is the reason I had what is my second epiphany. When I understood that caring for kids is really, really important. But even more important is that you bring skill. Because someone like Chris could have used the teacher I am now, and not the one that I was then. He had been poorly served his whole life. He came from a family of kind people who were hanging on to the edge of economic ruin, barely scrabbling by. I believe that those kids, when they went to bed at night, put on all of their clothes in order to stay warm. And he, as an 8th grader, who was probably a little older than he should be, maybe not one of the 16-year-olds, but he read at a 3rd grade level. And it was he who changed my heart about what I should do next, which is to learn how to help someone like Chris. And so that's what drove my next change. However, I had a little time yet before I get to that change. When I finished at that middle school, I taught in San Antonio at La Escuela de las Americas, which was a bilingual charter school. That's actually the school. One year, this was my classroom right here. They had raised beds. You can still see them. I think this is a fairly recent photo. It was associated with something called the Mexican-American Unity Council, which is right across the street, and they funded this school. All of my students' parents were Spanish speakers, and many of my students didn't have great English. Once again, I wasn't wonderfully prepared. But I did speak Spanish of a sort. So I wasn't a total waste of space, and I learned a lot from them. This time it was 4th graders, and I stayed with them into the 5th grade. And I added that picture because I was going to add something culturally about this experience. One of the things that they celebrate big in San Antonio is La Grita, which is a speech. La Grita means the scream or the shout, that was given by a priest who spoke to a crowd before the revolution in Mexico, but he called them to fight for independence. And they celebrate La Grita. And in our school, we had a parade. I made costumes for the kids, or my 5th graders anyway. And we did a parade through the neighborhood, and lots and lots of mothers were there with lots of good food. But this particular picture is something that kills me, so I have to tell you about it. It's called Los Viejitos, which means the old little ones. Old children would be one way to say it. Yeah, when you see Ballet de Folklorico do this dance, it is older people. And they come out with these guys, you can see they have canes, but they come out like this. The music's very slow, and they're all teetery. And these people have masks on so that you can at least buy the fiction that they are old. But we had the little 3rd graders, or not 3rd graders, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds did it. And it's hilarious when children do it because, of course, they can do this, but they're not very convincing. But it was wonderful. The culture was wonderful. The experience was enriching, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But the daughter had a young daughter and no husband, and she was ready to go back to college herself. So who am I not to go encourage her education? So she needed me to be with her so that she could do this. So I moved back. She was at this point in Connecticut, going to the University of Connecticut, which if you don't know yet, is where my PhD will come from. Sorry, I keep hitting my mic. Every time I do it, then I remember. So I relocated and found a job almost immediately. Before I left, I was looking, but I didn't have any nibbles, not a nibble, until I got there. But then I threw out a bunch of resumes, and this residential treatment facility said they were obviously desperate and thought I would be perfect. And I taught there for 10 years, so I must have been okay. And so that you'll understand what a residential, or this residential treatment facility looks like. Actually, I have, well, okay, I don't know if I do or not anymore. I've forgotten the pictures I have. That is something called Natchog Hospital. That is the school. That's Journey House School. This is the hospital on the right. Not much to look at. It's small, and it is a private hospital that treats people with mental issues or drug addiction issues. And our students were all what they call adjudicated adolescent girls, so they were in trouble with the law. They were sentenced to be in our school and spent typically the rest of their sentence providing they had already served anytime, anywhere. So you can imagine all of them, on a good day, there were a lot of issues. And on a bad day, there were some bad issues. But most of the time, as with all of our students, they have something that they need from us, and they need to finish their education, which is, for them, for the most part, been interrupted by behavior issues and gang activity and drug deals, ordinary stuff. They were wonderful to teach because some of them always wanted to learn. And you could always make the connection with most of them and sometimes with all of them. So it was very gratifying, but you have to, with this population, you need to bring your best game every day. And I began to see that I was not. Some of the fun had gone out of this. This population is particularly exhausting. I don't know how social workers do it, parole officers, day after day. These are sad, sad stories. Many of my students are dead. That's how sad it is. So I knew it was time to consider a career change. And that's when I went back for the PhD. And that was because I thought I wanted to teach teachers. And the nice thing in Connecticut I need to mention, but I understand it's true in Arizona, it's also true in Massachusetts. I don't think it's true in Nebraska, but once you reach 60-something, you go tuition free. I don't have any debt for this. So that was a big motivator. University of Connecticut has a fabulous, fabulous reputation. I did a 5th year before I went into the PhD program. I think it was kind of iffy because I struggled with taking a test. I forget what it's called, the GMAT? No. The what? GRE. Yes, yes. I took it twice. But I did get in because they could see that I was bringing something unique. My personal experience with these last 10 years had been really, really formative for me and probably made me a better teacher all the way around. And certainly I was ready to learn to understand some of the stuff that I'd been dealing with every day. So I had to go full-time, which means I had to stop teaching. But it was timed nicely because I could already collect Social Security. And I had a tiny retirement that got me through, and a friend who let me rent her upstairs for $300 a month. Yes. That's how I got through what would have been a hardship. It wasn't. And at the end of that, when I might have been writing my dissertation proposal, I wandered out to the internet to look to see who would want somebody who was what they call ABD. This is all but dissertation. So I don't have that degree. I'm still just a master's, which is good, but not all that it needs to be when you're teaching in college. So the interesting thing about it is that Chadron was desperate at a time when I was just casting around. And I looked at Chadron. I went online, I toured the town, I did the Google Maps, I did the streets, and I could see a town that looked a lot like my town, the town that I came from. And I asked, did I think that I could leave my family, because both of my daughters are in either Massachusetts or Connecticut. And all the grandkids are on the East Coast, except for the one at School of Mines. And I asked whether I could come and live in this place. And it was easy. It was easy, because I could see that this would be good. And I feel fortunate that I landed in a place like this. Oftentimes a Graves lecture covers our dissertation topic, because one assumes that I'm knowledgeable of about what I've been studying for these many years and writing a paper and doing research. I am really knowledgeable on peer tutoring. But I don't want to tell you, I don't think anybody's really interested unless you're a reading teacher. Because I've tried to tell, you want to read my paper? And I get the glazed look. So I'm just guessing it's, that it would be wise for me to skip it. But so you'll know why my study is unique. Peer tutoring is old. If you remember the days where you might have had the single-room schoolhouse, you will have older kids helping younger kids. That was peer tutoring in its most basic form, because very often they can be just as effective as a teacher, depending on the relationship between the two, that is, student and tutor. But for peer tutoring, in my case, my focus is on adolescent students, because by the time they're teenagers, by the time they're in the 5th grade, they're getting no education on reading anymore. Everybody assumes they can read, and if they can't, then they might get identified and get some intervention, but they might not. They might be able to slip by. And then you get to be adolescents, and the work gets harder, the textbooks get more complicated, and there are fewer supports all the way around, and you begin slipping behind and starting to struggle with this harder work, and there's a separation between you and your peers that because you are suddenly aware of your weakness, your flaw, your differences, and they very often give up. They say, school's not for me, I hate school, I hate reading, and I hate you, meaning the teacher. And the nice thing about an intervention using peer tutoring with adolescents who struggle to read at grade level is that they often can be very effective. There are also side benefits. When students begin to lose those connections with their peers because of their academic difficulties, they are less accepted in the social milieu. They become less cool. They start drifting away towards the kids who have behavior issues. And it's like a bad snowball. And if you can, when you do these, all the studies I've read anyway, indicate that when you institute peer tutoring, you reconnect, the separation becomes united better, they listen better to their peers, they actually make more advances because there's no adult hanging over them, and it's win-win-win everywhere. The way I do peer tutoring, typically, and it's not the way everybody does it, peers take turns. They're not all, you don't have to match them with a good reader with a poor reader. You actually just take turns coaching and saying, are you struggling with that word? You need some help here. And at the end of it, they spend time talking so that they create a comprehension together in a kind of what they call collaborative cognitive, what is it, Eric? Cognitive?
I was going to go constructivism. Peer tutoring.
Oh, but this is one of the things we talk about all the time, because it's something that happens when you talk to somebody trying to clarify a question that both of you are actually processing more deeply, and that's one of the things that happens when you peer tutor, and it has one of those words in it. So I can't tell you all about what I'm doing in this study. I'm at what they call pre-baseline at this point. I haven't even begun to teach them peer tutoring skills. But the intervention has to do with a behavior that often results from peer tutoring. And I really can't, they don't know what I'm going to do. But just broadly, what happens very often is that the language becomes more positive between peers. I piloted this study I went back to my old school. I didn't know these students at all. I taught them how to peer tutor, and I only spent like 2 weeks with them, and their behaviors began to improve, and they reached out to the newbie. And in a girls' school, oftentimes they've got history, and they shun and avoid the newbie, especially if they've got history. And they embraced somebody that was a newbie and would have been excluded otherwise. Anyway, this is what the teachers who normally teach these girls told me. So in special ed especially, and in my career with those girls with behaviors, the rewards are slim, really. They don't come and say, "I love you, Mrs. Hayes." They don't say, "Oh, you're leaving? Oh, that's so sad." They say, "See ya." It's not like, our ideal about how little kids, attach and so strongly. So that you've got to look for your rewards in a more subtle way, I guess. And I was deeply rewarded working with these girls. And that pilot study encouraged me to see that I had a good idea and it was worth pursuing. So when things were grim and the dissertation was dragging, I didn't have any trouble getting back to it. So back to my closing. I haven't timed this. I was hoping I wouldn't get to the point where you're saying, "Whoa, geez, stop." Okay, so I've already introduced my introduction to Chadron, and I wanted to thank you for being the kind people in Chadron that make my decision so clear and so obvious that it was the right one. I have had many, many what I call Chadron moments. I've left my purse more than once, and it's always been there. But it's not just that. It's people reaching out and being kind. And there's plenty of that here. And I'm so, so glad, because when I came, I think that there were some concerns that this was a big leap. I know my daughters both thought this was a little insane, and wondered how this was going to be. And they are reassured based on my Chadron moments, which I share. But I've spent some time worrying about why I decided to tell this story, because fundamentally it's all about me. And that makes me a little uncomfortable. But I think I was motivated primarily by my students, some of them are here, to see that when you want to be a teacher, when you put your eye on that as what you want to do with yourselves, everything you've ever learned will be useful. Nothing is wasted. Even though I went this way and I went that way, and you may too. Things will happen in your lives that will throw you off. But it all culminates, and you land where you should be, which is what's happened to me. That's it. That's the real ending. Questions, anyone?
So what do you have left to do to get?
For the PhD?
Yeah.
I have to complete the study, which I have just initiated at the middle school. And that will end this school year. In fact, I won't be there for their last week. I need to give them a break. And I go there every day, last 30 minutes of their school day, and we will do peer tutoring, and we will, when that's done, I'm collecting data, that's part of it. At this point, I'm giving them assessments to establish a baseline where they are with their reading fluency and with their behaviors and with their communication skills, because that's what I'm hoping to change. And then midway through, I will introduce this extra piece, and that's when the data collection becomes more important, because my data, I need to be able to draw a graph that shows, ooh, right? They benefit, or something changed in a positive way. But in fact, all I had to do after that is to write it down. If they don't go, ooh, it doesn't much matter to whether my dissertation is acceptable as long as I've implemented the study in a very vigorous and replicable manner so that someone else can see I could do that study and say, yes, this is in fact worth doing in the classroom. Because ultimately, that's why anybody does research, is to see how it's going to benefit. In our case, it's education. And so once I collect all my data and I wrap it up pretty in a bow, I resubmit it to the University of Connecticut, and they say yes or no. And if they say yes, I think I get to call myself Dr. Hayes.
Are you focusing primarily on peer tutoring in middle schools, or?
It's adolescent, but the thing with establishing or setting up a study when your participants are humans, and especially when they're children, you have to be pretty careful about the population that you study. And I need permission from the school to get in there. I need permission from the classroom teacher to let me be in there. I need permission from the parents to let me work with their children, so that it becomes fairly complex. And in the end, in Chadron, I don't have a lot of choices. This intervention should be for older students. I was offered 5th grade. I talked to my advisor in Connecticut. He says, 5th grade's fine. Because, in fact, the first data on peer tutoring was gathered in elementary. So if I had my druthers, I would have selected a different population, a different age group. But I'm happy with this, because everybody seems not to be too bothered by me. Well, to go and do what I'm doing is pretty disruptive to their usual routine. So they could mind, but they don't seem to. So anybody want to ask about Panama? That's the most exotic. Second to that is Ireland. Everybody knows something about Ireland.
It looks beautiful. It's on my bucket list. I want to go.
And it's interesting to be in Geltak. Where the culture is still solidly embedded in their family language and in their religion and in their appreciation for English. I'm not saying that they love English, but what happens when you translate Irish into English turns into something much richer. I don't know what you guys know about Irish poetry or Irish stories or Irish literature at all, but it is incredibly rich. The only thing I can think of, and it came to me recently because I was telling the 5th graders about St. Patrick and snakes and that kind of stuff. So I taught them a few words because I learned a little bit of Irish. But here's a good example of someone who spoke Irish at home and translated it into English. He had been fishing in the oyster beds, and my husband asked him, so, his name is Dennis, but everybody called him Denishine, which means little Dennis. So Denishine, how were the oysters? And he says, sure, you couldn't put a jacket on a gooseberry with what he'd earned. He said, with what I got paid. So if you see what I mean, it just gets richer. One of my weaving buddies, a little girl, came into the house when I was in their house, and she was ready to eat, and she says to her mother in Irish, I have the hunger of the world on me. So, I mean, that's what I mean about what the Irish do with English. It's so wonderful. Yes. It's worth going to someplace else and to get embedded in their culture as you are enriched by it. Now I'm going to be embedded in Chadron. I'm not sure what that's going to look like.
Well, I can say we're lucky to have you, and I was so super excited, and you did not disappoint.
Oh, good, good, good. Thank you so much for coming in spite of the winter wonderland.